long before the Navajo Nation had a name recognized by the United States government, and long before archaeologists ever set foot in northwestern New Mexico, the Diné were already telling a story about what came before them. They spoke of worlds beneath this one, not distant myths reserved for children, but a layered history of underworlds their ancestors had actually lived through, worked through, and eventually climbed out of, worlds that existed beneath the deserts their descendants would one day call home. According to that tradition, the people who exist today are not the first. Earlier worlds came first, and inside them lived beings the Diné call the holy people, the Diné, who shaped the world long before anything resembling the present one existed. Then, sometime in the late 1800s, ranchers and explorers pushing into the canyons of the Four Corners began finding something the Diné had never needed to discover: cities. Built into the rock, some of them literally underground, walls too straight to be accidental, rooms too numerous to count in a single afternoon, hundreds of rooms stacked 3 and 4 stories high against sheer sandstone cliffs, hidden ceremonial chambers sunk directly into the earth beneath them, doorways aligned with a precision that seemed to track the movement of the sun, and passages that seemed to lead nowhere a rancher or a soldier would expect to find anything at all. More than a century later, one question still hasn't gone away. Were these ruins simply the forgotten leftovers of a vanished people, as the earliest American excavators assumed? Or had the Navajo, without ever needing photographs or field notes, already known exactly who built them and why they were gone? Today, we're looking at the historical record, the excavation reports, and the Diné oral tradition surrounding one of the most extraordinary archaeological landscapes in North America. To understand why this story still matters, we need to go back long before Richard Wetherill ever picked up a shovel in Chaco Canyon, long before any survey crew mapped a single kiva to a tradition the Navajo had already been carrying for generations. For the Diné, this was never simply folklore. It was history, carried the way history has always been carried before there was any other way to carry it. Their oldest traditions describe a journey through 4 worlds before arriving in this one. The first world was black, and small and crowded with beings who were not yet fully formed as people. Some remembered as winged and insect-like, moving through a darkness that had no sun or moon yet to light it. The second world was blue, the third was yellow, and each carried its own inhabitants, its own conflicts, and its own reasons the people eventually had to leave. Worlds ended in flood or discord among those living there, or simply became too crowded to hold what was growing inside them, and each time, the survivors were guided upward through an opening in the world above into whatever waited next. The final passage brought them into the glittering world, the fourth world, the one we live in now, according to tradition. First man and first woman led the people up through a hollow reed that grew tall enough to reach the opening above. That opening was not symbolic. It was remembered as an actual place, tied to actual geography, in much the way the Hopi-Sipapu is tied to a real location near the Grand Canyon. But what makes the Diné tradition especially compelling is what is said to have existed in those earlier, underground worlds before the people ever climbed out of them. According to tradition, the earlier worlds were never empty. They were already occupied by beings with their own knowledge and their own long history beneath the surface, beings the Diné had to negotiate with, learn from, and sometimes escape entirely. Some ceremonial accounts describe structured dwellings belonging to these earlier beings, rooms and directions and colors assigned to each wall, rather than simple caves. These accounts were never written down for outsiders. They were preserved the way most Diné knowledge was preserved, through ceremony, through memory, through the exact repetition of a story from one generation's medicine people to the next. They existed completely independent of archaeology, independent of the United States government, independent of any expedition that would later claim to discover anything in this landscape. Then, in the final years of the 19th century, an actual excavation began on Navajo land that appeared to confirm something the Diné had never needed confirming in the first place. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel researches forgotten history through primary documents, excavation records, and indigenous oral tradition. And if that's the kind of thing you enjoy, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps, and it lets me keep digging into stories like this one. Because what happened next in Chaco Canyon wasn't a rumor printed once and never followed up on. It was a fully documented excavation backed by one of the most respected scientific institutions in the country, and it uncovered something almost too large to believe. In 1888, a rancher named Richard Wetherill had already stumbled onto Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde while chasing stray cattle through the canyons of southwestern Colorado. Word of what he'd found spread quickly among collectors, museums, and the small community of self-taught explorers working the Four Corners region. By 1896, Wetherill had turned his attention south into a remote, sun-blasted canyon in northwestern New Mexico the Navajo had lived alongside for generations. The dig was financed by the Hyde brothers, wealthy New York patrons, and overseen at a distance by Frederick Putnam, one of the most respected archaeologists in the country, who assigned a 23-year-old assistant named George Pepper to supervise the fieldwork rather than leave it entirely to Wetherill. Together, they began digging into a massive stone structure the Spanish had once named Pueblo Bonito. What they found didn't look like a village. It looked like a city built to be permanent, its walls veneered in tight, deliberate patterns of stacked sandstone that no casual builder would have bothered with more than 600 rooms. Some estimates suggest closer to 800, rose 3 and 4 stories against the canyon wall. Dozens of kivas, circular ceremonial chambers sunk directly into the ground, were built throughout the complex, including several massive great kivas large enough to hold entire communities at once. In one room alone, excavators uncovered more than 50,000 pieces of turquoise, along with thousands of pieces of carved jet and the skeletal remains of 14 scarlet macaws, birds that don't live anywhere near New Mexico. Macaws like these could only have come from far to the south, deep into what is now Mexico, hundreds of miles away. Decades later, residue testing on tall cylindrical jars recovered from the same rooms turned up traces of cacao, the plant used to make chocolate, sourced from nowhere closer than Mesoamerica. Marine shell ornaments traced back to the Gulf of California turned up in the same rooms, evidence of a trade network that stretched in every direction from a canyon with no water of its own. The scale of it raised an immediate question nobody could answer: who builds a city this size, this deliberately, in the middle of a desert with no permanent river? Chaco Wash only fills briefly after storms. Every beam of ponderosa pine used in construction, and there are tens of thousands of them, had to be carried on foot from forests at least 50 miles away, with no draft animals to help move them. Chaco wasn't acting alone either. Archaeologists have since identified more than 150 outlying great houses scattered across what's now Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, many apparently built to match Chaco's own architectural standards and oriented back toward the canyon itself, as though an entire region had organized itself around this one place. Then the excavation turned up something even stranger. For a structure this size, there should have been thousands of burials. Instead, researchers found barely 60, most of them concentrated in a single room. Whatever Pueblo Bonito had been used for, it did not appear to have functioned as an ordinary place where families lived and died, the way excavators originally expected. Some now believe it wasn't a city of permanent residents at all, but something closer to a capital, a ceremonial and political center pilgrims traveled toward rather than a place most people called home year-round. That theory only deepened when researchers began mapping what was radiating outward from the canyon. Hundreds of miles of engineered roads, some of them 30 feet wide, ran arrow-straight across the desert, regardless of the terrain in their way. They climbed directly up cliff faces using carved stairways instead of curving around them. Many didn't appear to lead toward any obvious destination at all. Conventional explanations point to trade and travel between outlying communities, but the roads were wider than trade ever required, straighter than practicality ever demanded, and several simply stop in the middle of open desert, going nowhere. Nearly a century after Wetherill's crew first broke ground at Pueblo Bonito, that question is still unresolved. As excavators kept working through Pueblo Bonito's rooms, they needed a name for the people who had built it. Nobody living in 1896 could say for certain what these builders had called themselves. So Wetherill borrowed one. He began referring to them by a Navajo word he'd picked up during his years working across Diné land, Anasazi, generally translated as something close to ancient enemies, or the ancient ones who came before. The name stuck. For most of the 20th century, it became the standard archaeological term for the people of Chaco Canyon, printed in textbooks and museum placards across the country. But there was something uncomfortable buried inside that detail, something archaeology took decades to fully sit with. The word wasn't a mystery waiting to be solved by science. It was already a name the Navajo had been using for these ruins, and for the people who built them long before any excavation, any museum, or any expedition arrived to hand them one. The Diné had never needed Wetherill's shovel to know something significant had happened in these canyons. Their oral tradition already carried memory of an earlier people, builders who had come before, who had raised structures across this landscape, and then, generations before white settlers arrived, were gone. None of that proves exactly why Pueblo Bonito was built the way it was. And most archaeologists today avoid the term Anasazi altogether, preferring ancestral Puebloan instead, out of respect for the modern Pueblo nations, including the Hopi, Zuni, and Acoma, who trace their own ancestry directly back to Chaco's builders. The people were never a vanished race in the way 19th century explorers assumed. They didn't disappear. They migrated, and their descendants are still here, carrying their own separate migration traditions describing clans that left canyons very much like this one in search of a permanent home. That detail matters because it means at least 3 independent traditions, Diné, Hopi, and the other Pueblo nations, all preserve some memory of movement connected to these canyons, long before any of them had reason to compare notes with each other, and long before an archaeologist ever showed up asking questions. There's an echo here of the Diné emergence tradition too. According to that tradition, the underground worlds the people passed through were never arranged at random. Every home, every direction, every color carried meaning. Chaco's own great houses were built the same way, their walls oriented to the cardinal points and to the rising and setting of the sun and moon across the year, as though position in the world was never something to leave to chance. What the Diné oral tradition and the archaeological record do share, though, is timing and the shape of the story itself. Both describe an earlier people connected to these canyons. Both describe a departure that happened generations before outside record-keeping began, and both agree that whatever happened here occurred on a scale too large to explain away as ordinary abandonment. Tree ring records eventually offered part of an answer. Around 1130, a severe decades-long drought settled over the region just as major construction at Chaco stopped completely. Doorways in several great houses were deliberately sealed. Some great kivas appear to have been intentionally burned rather than simply left to decay, a detail some archaeologists read as ceremony, not accident, closer to a ritual departure than a disaster. That distinction still divides researchers. A drought explains why people might leave. It doesn't fully explain why they would seal doorways and burn ceremonial chambers on their way out, rather than simply walking away from a place that could no longer support them. As word of Wetherill's discoveries spread east, his methods drew increasing criticism from professional archaeologists, who accused him of removing artifacts faster than he could properly document them and of favoring one museum's claim to the finds over the country's. Complaints from universities and museum officials helped push Congress toward passing the Antiquities Act in 1906, the first federal law protecting archaeological sites on public land. The following year, President Theodore Roosevelt placed Chaco Canyon itself under permanent federal protection as a national monument. The find that had made Wetherill famous was now officially too important to belong to any one man. It belonged to the country. And whether anyone in Washington fully realized it yet, it belonged to the Navajo families who had never stopped living around its walls. By then, Wetherill had already stepped back from formal archaeology. He stayed in Chaco Canyon anyway, running cattle and operating a trading post beside the ruins he'd spent over a decade excavating. His relationship with the Navajo families living around him had never been simple. Some considered him a fair neighbor, others accused him of mistreatment, of running his cattle illegally onto reservation land, of taking advantage of families who depended on his trading post for credit. When the boundary of the Navajo reservation shifted eastward in 1909, Wetherill's ranch found itself surrounded almost entirely by Diné land, and the tension around him only grew tighter. On the afternoon of June 22, 1910, while driving cattle with a ranch hand, Wetherill crossed paths with a Navajo man named Chish Chilling Begay. Accounts of exactly what triggered the confrontation still don't fully agree: a dispute over a horse, retaliation for an earlier beating, months of accumulated resentment reaching a breaking point. What isn't disputed is the outcome. Within minutes, Wetherill was shot and killed on the same ground where he'd uncovered 50,000 pieces of turquoise 14 years earlier. He is buried in a small cemetery near Pueblo Bonito, close enough to the great house that his grave and the ruin share the same horizon. 10 years later, in 1920, the National Geographic Society funded a new, far larger expedition into Chaco Canyon under archaeologist Neil Judd, picking up formal excavation almost exactly where Wetherill had left it, this time with the full weight of institutional science behind it. Unlike the Grand Canyon story from 1909, nothing about Chaco simply vanished from the record. The rooms are still there. The turquoise is catalogued. The kivas have been mapped, photographed, and studied for more than a century. In recent years, researchers have turned to LiDAR and satellite imagery to trace the road network from above, and it keeps turning up more of it, additional segments buried under decades of blown sand, suggesting the system was even larger than anyone standing on the ground in Wetherill's time could have realized. And still, the largest questions remain open. Why a structure the size of Pueblo Bonito was built with so few permanent residents? What 400 miles of arrow straight roads were actually for, when so many of them seemed to lead toward nothing at all? Whether Chaco functioned as a city, a capital, a pilgrimage site, or something without a clean modern equivalent, archaeology has answered the question of who built these places and where their descendants live today. What it hasn't fully answered is why, or what it actually felt like to stand inside Pueblo Bonito's plaza around the year 1100, watching 4 stories of stone rise around you in the middle of the desert. The Diné have never claimed to hold every answer either. What their tradition preserves is something else, a memory of worlds beneath this one, of dwellings that existed underground long before anyone needed a shovel to find them, and a name for the builders of Chaco that predates every excavation report ever filed on this canyon. Whether that memory describes literal history, sacred tradition, or some blend the modern mind isn't built to separate, is something each generation keeps returning to on its own terms. What can't be argued is how long it's lasted. Longer than the Antiquities Act. Longer than the National Monument designation. Longer than Wetherill's grave has sat beside the ruin that made him famous. Longer, even, than the word Anasazi has existed in an archaeology textbook. Perhaps that's the real reason Chaco Canyon still pulls people back. Not because the mystery has been solved, but because every generation that stands in that plaza asks some version of the same question the Diné have been asking for centuries. What was this place really built for, and who is still meant to remember it? Thank you for watching. If you're drawn to documentaries that dig into forgotten history through excavation records, primary sources, and indigenous oral tradition, consider subscribing for more investigations like this one. Before you go, I'd like to know what you think. Do you think Navajo tradition and the Chaco excavations describe 2 separate stories that simply happened to overlap? Or do you think one was always describing the other? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.